Hello, this week we're going to continue applying the principles of supply and demand and putting them together and gaining a better understanding of the market system. As we move through this week in chapter 4, please continue to remind yourself about the law of supply and the law of demand. The terms and principles that you've learned in chapter 3. So let me go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint for this week. And this will again be in chapter 4. And in many textbooks, chapter 3 and chapter 4 go together. This textbook separated the two of them, but the principles and the concepts are very related in both chapters. So as I mentioned, we are going to continue our exploration of the market system using the ideas from chapter 3. And then we'll also recognize that sometimes the market system fails and there are problems in the market system. In general, however, many economists believe that the market system works very well in many goods and services. And many times it does work. There is a connection between our demand and our supply of goods and services, wants and needs, and oftentimes the market system does provide efficient solutions. So if you'll remember, the law of demand simply says as the price of the product rises, the quantity demanded goes down. And you'll remember I was very clear that it's the quantity demanded that goes down when the price of the product rises. We also learned the law of supply, which simply says as the price of the product rises, the quantity supplied also goes up. And again, I'm very clear that it's a change in price of the product means the quantity supplied is going to change. We did learn that there were things that would shift the supply and demand of goods and services. Any of these things that change will give you an entirely new function, a new shift in the demand or a shift in the supply. We also better understood that there is an equilibrium, and that's simply the point where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. And at that equilibrium price, we tend to be very efficient. And if you remember in our demand curve and our supply curve, we have that equilibrium and we say that the market clears at that equilibrium. Now, it's important for you to remember that that price may not necessarily be the price you experience in the grocery store, for example. So for example, in this case, if my equilibrium is $40, but the price in the store is $70, you'll notice that a whole lot of items are still sitting on the shelf because you have a surplus, because the quantity supplied at 70 is much greater than the quantity demanded at 70. If the price on the shelf is too low, you'll realize that you have an empty shelf. The quantity supplied is much less than the quantity demanded, and you have a shortage. So when you have a surplus and a shortage, the only way to eliminate them is to somehow get the price back to the equilibrium price. So in this chapter, we're going to explore what happens when supply and demand change. So remember those shifters, keep those in the back of your mind. You may even want to write them down on an index card or something. Keep them in the back of your mind, but we'll begin to examine what happens if supply increases and demand decreases? Or what happens if they both increase? Or there's all kinds of other combinations of changes that can happen. Now, as we move through this, it's important for you to remember the principle, the assumption that economists rely on, ceteris paribus, which means all else held constant. So when we talk about these shifts in supply and demand, we recognize in reality there might be other things also happening, but we're not going to incorporate those into our model. We're going to simplify our model. We're just going to focus on a couple of variables at the same time. So for example, let's say that in the market for toys, there was an increase in the supply and a decrease in the demand. So let's say, for example, the number of producers increases. That's your increase in supply. And let's also assume that taste and preferences are fading. Nobody wants this toy anymore. So that's a demand shifter. That's going to decrease your demand for the product. So if we had an equilibrium before, so let's use this example and say our equilibrium was 60 and the quantity was 200. So 200 units put on the shelf, or I'm sorry, 200,000 per year were put on the shelf at a price of $60 and the market cleared. That's our equilibrium now. But now we're going to shift our supply and shift our demand. So supply is going to increase because the number of producers increases. So an increase in supply is going to shift it to the right. You'll notice that at every price, the quantity supplied is higher. So you have a whole new function. The decrease in demand, tastes and preferences are decreasing. So that's a shift to the left. That means that at every price, the quantity demanded is lower. And in this case, you'll notice we have a new equilibrium. You'll notice that the equilibrium used to be at 60, but now the equilibrium, in my graph, it's around 30 or so. But you'll notice the quantity is exactly the same as it was before. Now, what I'd like you to do is just take a moment just to look at that graph and look at those shifts and see if you can figure out how it is that my quantity stayed the same at the equilibrium. The price changed, but the quantity actually stayed the same. What is it about that graph that made that happen? So you may recognize that the shifts that I drew were exactly the same. They were proportional to each other. In reality, however, that may not happen. In reality, one shift may be bigger than the other shift. There may be something that's of more significance in the market. So let's say, for example, that the number of producers increasing was phenomenal. And so we have a huge change in the supply of the toy. The demand decreased, but not that much. You'll notice we have a new equilibrium. And at that new equilibrium, we have a lower price, but we also have a much larger equilibrium quantity. So really the only thing that we can tell, if demand and supply are moving in the same direction, in opposite directions, you can only determine what's going to happen to the price. You cannot determine what's going to happen to the quantity. So in this case, supply and demand moved in opposite directions. No matter how you draw it, the price is going to be lower. The quantity may be the same, it may be more, or it may be less. I'd prompt you to pause the video and see if you can draw a shift in this market such that the equilibrium price is lower and the equilibrium quantity is also lower. See if you can figure out how that's going to happen. So hopefully you realize that to get a lower equilibrium price and a lower equilibrium quantity, the demand has to be the more important factor. The demand shift has to be much larger than the supply shift. So what happens if both supply and demand increase? So let's say, for example, there's an increased number of consumers. Is that a supply shifter or a demand shifter? So that's a demand shifter. And there's also a decreased cost of inputs. So it gets cheaper to make the product. So that's your supply shifter, and supply will increase because it's cheaper to make the product. So in this market, we'll just say the equilibrium again was 60 and the quantity was 200. That's where our equilibrium used to be. But in this case, we're going to increase the supply because the decreased cost of production, and we're going to increase the demand because of the increased number of consumers. So in this case, you notice my equilibrium quantity is greater. The price actually stayed the same, but the quantity is greater. Can you recognize what it is about that graph that made the price stay the same even though the quantity went up? So hopefully you put this together. It has to do with the proportional changes. So in this graph, I drew the supply and demand shifts identical to each other proportionally. So the influences appear to be identical. So the price stayed the same, but the quantity went up. Well, let's say what happens if instead of the demand going up just a little bit, the demand goes up by an awful lot. You'll notice in this case, the equilibrium price goes from $60 to $80. Now, you'll also notice that the quantity went up also. The equilibrium quantity was at 200. Now it's at a little bit past 450. So the thing for you to remember in this case, if supply and demand are moving in the same direction, the equilibrium quantity is also going to move in that same direction, but you can't determine what's going to happen to the price. The price may go up, the price may go down. You can't determine what's going to happen. It's also important for you to recognize that if the market price does not adjust, then they're going to be out of the equilibrium. So for example, in this market, if we kept the price at $60, but had all of these shifts that happened, we'd end up with a shortage. Because at $60, the quantity demanded is much larger than the quantity supplied with all of these changes that are occurring. So I want you to apply this a little bit. In 2011, oil production in the country of Libya, which is a country in northern Africa, was interrupted by political unrest. And at the same time, demand for oil from China particularly was rising. And that was because the income levels were rising. The Chinese were purchasing larger numbers of cars. So there's a demand shifter. Incomes rising caused the demand for the good to rise. Do you remember if that's called a normal or an inferior good? So that's a normal good. Oil production was interrupted by political unrest. That's a supply shifter. So is supply going to shift to the right and increase, or is it going to shift to the left and decrease? So I want you to see if you can figure out, what do you suppose was the impact of these two changes happening at the same time? So pause the video, draw out a quick sketch, and see if you can figure out what happened. What can you tell for sure, and what you're just going to have to guess on because you need more information about which was more important. So hopefully you recognized with an increase in demand and a decrease in supply, you're going to get an increase in the price. And actually in 2011, the gas prices in the United States on average were over $3.74. In some places it was closer to $4. So the gas prices were rising in 2011. Now in 2012, Libya sort of calmed down a little bit. Their production increased. They're a major producer in Africa. The production increased, and see if you can think about what happened with that change. Demand was still strong, but the supply went back to what it once was. So you would think that would drop the price of gas, that would drop the price of oil. In reality, a whole lot of other things were also happening at the same time, and the price of gas dropped a little bit, but not as much as you might have thought. But again, this is where the idea of ceteris paribus comes in. The reality is there's factors all over the world that are affecting the price of oil. So we recognize that in many cases, the market seems to work okay. We get to an equilibrium and the market clears. But sometimes we get an equilibrium that for some reason society just doesn't like. And we'll have a couple of interventions that we'll talk about. One is the idea of a price ceiling, and the other is the idea of a price floor. And these are really laws that would be enacted by a government in order to influence the market. We end up with a situation that is not the equilibrium. So let's say, for example, we have a product that while the equilibrium price, let's say, is $40, we think that's too high. We just don't think people should have to pay that much for this product. And Congress and the government gets lobbied, and they establish what's known as a price ceiling. So a price ceiling is the highest that the price is allowed to go. It's the highest it's going to get. So the government would set a price ceiling underneath the equilibrium, because the idea is the equilibrium is too high. So the price ceiling is under the equilibrium. It's at a lower price. So in this case, what situation evolves when you have a price ceiling and the quantity demanded is much larger than the quantity supplied? So that's where you end up with a shortage. So interestingly, we will impose a price ceiling below the equilibrium because we think we're going to benefit the consumers. However, in reality, you're only going to benefit the consumers that have access to the limited quantity supplied. You'll benefit the first ones in line, but there's going to be many consumers that want it at that price and they can't get it at that price. So you end up with a shortage. Oftentimes in these cases, the government has to intervene. They may impose rationing. They may say you're only allowed to purchase a certain number of the units, maybe not as much as you would want. This is actually happening right now in the country of Venezuela. They've imposed price ceilings on many of their food items, and many of their food items are in very short supply. So another intervention that we can have is when we perceive that the equilibrium price is too low. For some reason, we think that that price is too low. Oftentimes, it's because the suppliers may not really be able to function very well with those low prices. And agriculture is the best example of a market in which the government imposes what are known as price floors. So a price floor is set above the equilibrium price, and it is as low as the price is allowed to drop. So in this case, the equilibrium is $40, but for some reason, the government says we're not going to let the price drop below $80. So interestingly, again, you're not in the equilibrium. You haven't cleared the market, but you'll also notice that the quantity supplied is much larger than the quantity demanded. So in this case, with quantity supplied larger than quantity demanded, do you remember what that's called? So that's called a shorted, or a surplus, sorry. That's a surplus. And interestingly, what happens in this case, you impose a price floor, you get a surplus. We think we're going to benefit the producers, but they produce so much of this item that they're actually not selling it all. And so oftentimes what has to happen is the government will buy up the surplus. In some cases, the surplus gets dumped in the ground or just left in the field to rot. But sometimes the government purchases the surplus, and then they might redistribute the surplus through a government commodities program in which individuals of lesser income are allowed to receive some of these surplus goods. I remember working at Paducah Cooperative Ministries several years ago in helping to distribute the government commodities. And one month, there was in everybody's bag that got the commodities, I believe it was a 5-pound bag of raisins. Thought that was an odd distribution. Why does everybody get 5 pounds of raisins? So I did a little digging, and apparently the raisin industry is subsidized by the government. And there was a year of great abundance with the grapes. And when they were dried for raisins, there was an awful lot of raisins. So the prices should have fallen, but there was a price floor. And what ended up happening was that people didn't buy up these raisins because the price was too high. So the government had to buy the raisins and then redistribute the raisins. We also recognize there's some kind of market failures that exist that the market really struggles with intervening and coming up with solutions. The chapter introduces 4 market failures. We'll discuss this in much greater depth later in the semester. But one of these market failures is the idea of an externality, which is a cost or a benefit that's borne to somebody other than the 2 parties directly involved in the transaction. So one of the best examples of a negative externality I can think of, I happen to live near a major factory. So if you live near a major factory, one of the things that you might experience in the middle of the night are the sirens going off. Or early in the morning, we happen to be able to hear the daily safety message. The message last week was for you to put down your cell phone when you're driving. That occurred it was about 6 o'clock in the morning or so. So I have nothing to do with this factory. I just happen to live nearby. But we always hear the sirens. We always hear the announcements through the entire neighborhood. Think about what would happen if you lived near a railroad track. You might have nothing to do with the railroad industry. You might never have even traveled on a train before. But every time the train goes by, you experience a negative externality because the noise affects you, or maybe even it shakes your house. You could experience a benefit based on somebody else's interactions in the market, and you might not have anything to do with that. So for example, if your neighbor landscapes their lawn, and so now out your front window you have a beautiful view, that might be a positive externality. You didn't go help your neighbor weed the garden. You didn't help your neighbor buy the shrubs, but you get to look out your window at a beautiful scene. So that's a positive externality. And the market really struggles with these positive and negative externalities. Another inner failure that we struggle with is the lack of competition. The reality is, in some cases, people don't really have much of a choice for the products that they're going to buy. And oftentimes, when there's a lack of competition, the prices tend to be a little bit higher. Now, I threw these two images up there, but I also would like to point out that it's not necessarily Walmart that is the best example of lack of competition. I throw up an example that has to do with shopping and point out to you that in many parts of this country, people live in what are known as food deserts. They live where there's really not a lot of options for groceries. You might have convenience stores, but you really don't have a lot of options for groceries. You might not be able to get fresh vegetables or even fresh meat. You might just have to rely on what the local convenience store has to offer. And oftentimes the prices are a little bit higher. So I'll share an example. My wife and I were out west last year, and in the great Southwest, there are many parts of the desert, Southwest, in which all you have available for food is the local Dollar General. I remember we were in one little town and we asked, where's the nearest Walmart? And the person said, oh, you can go 100 miles that way. And his wife responded, or you can go 160 miles the other way. Or you can use the local Dollar General and pay $3 for a gallon of milk. So lack of competition is something that the market really struggles with. And oftentimes the government is going to intervene in this situation. There's also a type of good that the markets really struggle to provide enough of. And these are what are known as public goods, and they meet three characteristics. One is that they are indivisible. It means you can't count them up into individual units. Most goods are divisible. I can count up the number of sodas in the vending machine. But a public good is indivisible. It's a good that just is. So for example, national defense. It just is. We don't say, oh, today was a good day. We had 40 units of national defense. Maybe we'll do better tomorrow and get 50 units of national defense. National defense just is. So it's indivisible. A public good is also non-rival. What that means is when one person consumes it, it's still available for everybody else. So again, for example, national defense. It's not as though the Army is telling you students, oh, good luck today. We can't defend you because we're defending Dr. Garricky today. They're going to defend the country. So granted, you may end up with a case where they are stretched too thin and the defense in one area reduces the amount of defense in another area. But in general, hopefully on a good day, they just provide defense. And so a public good is non-rival. It's also non-excludable. This doesn't mean it's free. It means that we cannot exclude somebody from consuming it. If they want the good, they can have the good. Now, somebody has to pay for it, but a public good is non-excludable. It means it's available for everybody. So again, national defense. It's not as though if something happened in this country, the military is going to go around and ask everybody to show their tax returns for last year to prove that they paid for national defense, and good luck to all the people that didn't pay taxes. They're going to defend everybody. So the idea of a public good is something that's indivisible, non-rival, and non-excludable. I generally believe that these are goods that we really don't provide enough of through the market system because of these characteristics. So for example, national defense, I've used that an awful lot. And I will say, if you are in the military or have had a family in the military or been in the military, know that I greatly appreciate your service. But I also recognize that public goods are these things that we just don't have enough of them. Education is a public good. Police protection is a public good. City parks are a public good. And generally, the market system doesn't provide enough of these things. And the last market failure has to do with inequality. The reality is there are haves and there are have-nots. That's just the way the market system works. And if our society doesn't necessarily like that, we're going to have to intervene in the market system. And that might mean that we get a solution that's not the equilibrium. So we have to ask ourselves, is the new solution something that we're willing to live with if it's not the equilibrium? The reality is sometimes people don't earn enough money to buy the things that they want. Sometimes people earn more than enough money to buy the things that they want. Sometimes the prices of things are too high for people to afford. Sometimes they're too low and the businesses are suffering. So inequality, an inequitable distribution of these goods and services is a problem that the market really can't fix. So hopefully you've learned in this chapter that there are many things that affect both supply and demand. There's numerous forces at work. In general, though, for many goods and services, we really don't even think about it because the market seems to provide a pretty efficient and pretty adequate solution. Economists do tend to believe that if there are interventions that are necessary, it's going to bring about a solution that's something different from the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. And we have to ask ourselves, are we willing to live with that difference? And we have to ask ourselves, is it worth it? So those are things that are normative economics. Remember, those are opinions. But those are questions that in reality we have to ask. But in general, we recognize that the market system is something that's always being shaped and is very fluid and oftentimes works well. And we have created some mechanisms to intervene when we don't like the market solution. In the next chapters, we're going to explore a little bit more. We'll explore in chapter 5 a little bit more about why the law of demand is the way that it is. What are some of the things that influence our demand for products? We're also going to explore in chapter 6 a little bit more detail as to our levels of satisfaction with consuming and certain goods and services. And then in chapter 7, we'll explore a little bit more depth to the law of supply and what are the things that affect the producers. What choices do they have to make when they make their decisions about supply? So really this whole unit just deals with the market system and the law of supply and the law of demand.